Yo, what is going on, guys? Epion here. Welcome back to another Division video. Today I wanted to just talk about the state of PvP in the Division and kind of just give my thoughts on exactly what it is Massive can do to help kind of rejuvenate the PvP side of the game as well as the Dark Zone and potentially bring more players back into the fold. Now, it's pretty clear that the current state of PvP in the Division is pretty bad. When you go into the Dark Zone, it basically just turns into a gank fest left and right. You've got teams of 4 hunting down solo players, and with the way that the gear sets function, it basically allows these teams to have a huge upper hand on anyone that they're going up against, and that really just doesn't make anybody ever want to go into the Dark Zone and experience that content. Now, the biggest problem with this is that you've got the two essentially kind of camps. You've got the guys who want to go into the Dark Zone to farm gear, to keep working on their gear sets, to keep getting the loot, and kind of just work on their character builds the way that they want. And then you've got the other guys who are the hardcore PvP players who actually want to engage in those combat scenarios with other players, test out their builds, or just kind of test out their own skills to kind of see exactly how it is they do up against other players. The biggest problem with all of this right now is the fact that most of those guys who are running in the Division as solo players who are looking for gear don't ever want to fight other players, and so they just wind up getting shot and killed by these groups of 4 who are doing essentially nothing more than simply just testing out their builds and their synergies. And some of this problem kind of can fall fairly solely on Massive shoulders for the fact that they haven't really paid attention to what the community has been saying, and basically saying that for the most part, no one really enjoys the way this is structured and no one really wants to engage in it. No one really believes that the Dark Zone is a true PvP experience, and I definitely agree with that because, I'm not a huge PvP player. I don't really enjoy going head-to-head against other players, mostly because I'm not that good at it. But with the Division, it's kind of been one of those things where earlier on, when you go back to kind of the alpha and the beta, when we were playing it in those two DZ01 and DZ02 spaces, it was actually a pretty fun experience. But the fact that you had to choose to go rogue in order to do the engagements just made it really not worth your time, because you'd die and you'd lose your experience, you'd lose your keys, you'd lose your loot. And it's like, what did I just put all this time in for if all that's going to happen is basically all of that hard work is just going to go for nothing? So some of the ideas I have are to first start out with Massive really should consider removing the way that certain stats work inside of the Dark Zone. Now, with the current meta, it's pretty clear that everybody is just focusing on enemy armor damage. When they reintroduced that into patch 1.5, now this basically became the new crit hit and crit chance damage that we saw in patch 1.2 and earlier, where basically you were just trying to burst your person down that you were fighting up against. Now, when I think back to World of Warcraft back in the early days in that scenario with PvP and PvE, what you had was that the players who were doing PvE had the best gear from the raid. And when they went into the PvP spaces, they basically would melt players left and right because they had those gear pieces, they had the stats to make it so that anybody who was going up against them really stood no chance. What Blizzard did to address this is they actually introduced a new stat that was called Resilience. And this stat was basically helped to mitigate damage while you were in PvP only. And if you took that gear that had that Resilience stat on it and went into PvE, it didn't really do anything for you. In addition to this, it made it so that players who were coming into matches wearing their PvE gear basically did not really do that much greater damage to players because all of their stats and abilities were being mitigated by this resilience ability. Now, this is something Massive can do and introduce into the game in patch 1.6, and I think the best way they can do this is to make it a flat stat that is maybe like a 30 or 40% damage reduction. And what they should do is have this be on the back end of the game and not anything on gear directly. So that way, when you're in PvP, it doesn't matter whether you're running an Alpha Bridge build, a Striker build, a Sentry build, you're going to be doing essentially your character's damage that you've invested in, and the mitigation is going to handle itself on the back end of the game. By making it so that players can't control the amount of damage that they mitigate, they're going to be able to focus more on getting those builds to just function the way they want it. Like the Firecrest build will be able to focus on either, doing as much damage it can from a fire source, whether it's the flame turret or it's the Seeker Mines. But then the person who is running that, they don't have to worry about investing much of their stats into being able to have high toughness, so that way they're not getting 1 or 2 shot. This would also make it easier for players who want to play like a sniper build. They can focus on headshot damage, they can focus on range damage and things like that, and you can actually get those variances in actual player builds and creativity. Now, the way that resilience could work would be similar to the way that Blizzard introduced it, where it only functions when you're in the Dark Zone or wherever the PvP area is. And when you're taking damage, it's going to first mitigate the base incoming damage based on that value, and then the rest of it is going to go through. Now, another thing Massive should do is to incentivize players to actually participate in PvP. Like I said, right now, when you go into the Dark Zone, you get killed, you lose experience, you lose currency, and granted, none of that stuff really matters since it doesn't require you to have a high rank in order to buy anything the vendors are selling. But it basically just kind of doesn't really give you a reason to want a PvP because you're not really earning anything. Now, what they could do is to essentially make it so that as you get a higher rank and you get more currency or whatever, you're able to purchase gear inside of the Dark Zone from the vendors, and that gear is a gear that's going to have this new PvP-focused mitigation stat. So that way, you're actually working towards an end goal in the PvP. They could easily introduce this, and so when people just jump straight into the division, anything that they do right now isn't going to have a huge impact on exactly, some of the combat that they encounter, because your stats aren't going to be they're not going to overwhelm other players. You basically would need to start PvPing, earn some rank, and then be able to go to the vendors and buy new pieces of gear and start helping you mitigate that damage that you would be taking from players while you're fighting them. And something that they should do with this is to make it so that you don't lose rank every time you die, so that way as you keep playing, you'll kind of keep moving towards a new tier of experience, or even levels, I guess is an easier way to describe it, and as you get to those new levels, you'll be able to purchase different sets of gear. This will also keep players coming back because they could also diversify it. So if I, for example, wanted to play as a tank in PvP, I could have a gear set that's dedicated or focused towards basically just making me much, much harder to kill, but, maybe not do as much damage when I'm fighting against other players. But then I can then switch and decide that I want to be a bit of a glass cannon or kind of like, a middle ground character that's able to do a decent amount of damage and also take a decent amount of damage without getting completely killed. They should also make sure that the gears aren't anything like the current gear sets where you have a 2-piece bonus, 3-piece bonus, or a 4-piece bonus. They should bring it back to the way that things were with the high ends, where you basically just had a single piece of gear and it had certain stats that you were after, you were trying to configure. And basically that should be what it is in the way that players should be able to build their characters. And if they want to be able to do a lot of damage and be a glass cannon, they can then focus on a piece of gear that has very static stats, like the firearms, stamina, and electronics have those kind of be set between a range that they can kind of get to when it's on a higher piece of tier gear. And then you as a player can kind of pick and choose maybe the minor attributes where, say, you want to have higher assault rifle damage because you like playing with assault rifles, or if you want to get something with better shotgun damage or better shotgun stagger, you can do that. And then also, players who want to be support or healer roles, they can focus on getting those stats and those minor attributes on those pieces of gear. Next up, I think that Massive really needs to do away with the rogue system. Right now, the rogue system is nothing but basically bait. People use it to just get other players to either go rogue accidentally, or they kind of just, again, kill players and try to bait them into fighting them, because when someone goes rogue in the Dark Zone right now, what happens is the entire server basically starts hunting them down, and you go from having this one player who maybe was going rogue by fighting players one-on-one or one-on-two, is just basically becomes a 23-man hunt versus one other person. I think as soon as you walk into the Dark Zone, everybody needs to be flagged for PvP. You can kill other players, they can kill you, and there isn't going to be the same sort of consequences that used to be available when you would go rogue. And it would also, again, encourage actual fights with other players, because I think right now, the way it is few people really want to be the person to pull the trigger first and have the entire server start hunting them. On top of that, the whole rogue system isn't really rewarding. I mean, yeah, you can survive a manhunt or, a level 4 rogue status and earn some experience, some currency, but again, none of that really matters because there's nothing that you're putting those levels or all of that currency towards, because everything that you need in order to be participating in PvP, you're getting by doing some of the main PvE content, farming the gear sets and everything like that. In addition to this idea, I think Massive really needs to consider unmarrying the PvP from Dark Zone. When we think back to the way that the zone was originally pitched to us, it was supposed to be this place where you could go to get the best loot in the game, and at the same time have to worry about whether or not other players were going to turn and try to take that loot from you. As it stands right now, no one goes into the Dark Zone to farm loot because of all of the other changes that they've made to the game. It's pretty easy to get gear just from about any other source content. Granted, the Dark Zone is still one of the best ways to do it because you don't have to kind of queue up and wait for stuff to load and everything like that. You basically just run a farming loop, kill the bosses, open chests, extract, rinse, and repeat. Having those two separate, I think, would be a good opportunity for players who actually want to engage in fighting other players to get that experience that they want. And if we look at survival, it's pretty clear that it's very possible for Massive to have these instances where you're participating in a specific game mode where you can choose to either have it be PvE focused or you can have to have it be PvP focused. There's absolutely no reason why that the community should be so against the idea that the Dark Zone could have a PvE only component where players, are just farming for gear and not having to worry about other players killing them. Most of you guys know that you don't go into the Dark Zone because you're trying to farm gear. You're in there because you want to get that competitive fight against other players. And having a more focused instance for you where you're just going to be fighting against other players, I think is going to be far better than the current scenario that it is right now. For that PvE only Dark Zone, it's possible that, to kind of give it some spice and give it some life, they could introduce the hunter system that is currently inside of survival to have it so that every time somebody extracts, a hunter gets spawned in the game, and that hunter then starts hunting players in it. And I mean, the hunters in the game currently are pretty tough to fight against. You can use some different mechanics to make it easier, but imagine being in a server where all of a sudden you've got 24 hunters running around trying to kill players as they try to get loot or extract loot, and it turns out that you're going to have to team up with other players to bring them down. Still has the concept of players having to worry about other quote-unquote agents going against them, but at the same time allows them to focus on what it is they want to do, which is to get loot. Adding in PvP modes probably would be a good idea as well, because right now when you go rogue, again, you're not really getting anything out of it. Sure, you're getting the enjoyment of fighting against other people or just killing other people. Adding in new modes would make it a bit more pleasant for players to be able to actually focus on getting something done. They could do something like everybody starts in DZ01 and you basically have to go from different checkpoint to different checkpoint, and along that way you have to kill a certain number of players, or you try to have to be the one person to survive in that specific zone. And then once all the players are dead, everybody moves up to the next one, and by the time you get to the final zone that's in the Dark Zone or wherever the PvP area is, whoever has the highest score can obviously be, dubbed the winner of that match. Massive could also add in modes for teams so that, for example, you have to capture certain landmarks or a number of landmarks, and then whichever team has the most landmarks by the end of the match, that's the team that's made the winner. And obviously, add in some penalties so that when your teammates get killed, it takes a little bit longer for them to respawn, so that way things kind of just last a little bit longer and you're not seeing modes or matches just end in a few minutes or anything like that. Additionally, I think a expansion to the map is way, way overdue. Everybody's familiar with the same 6 zones, running in and out of them and getting to certain points is pretty much the same, and maybe just kind of giving us something fresh to look at would definitely help. Finally, I think Massive should figure out a way to improve the actual combat mechanics in the Dark Zone. Essentially right now, everybody just basically runs around hip firing and not really using any tactics, and for a game that was pitched as a cover tactical based shooter, it really doesn't translate into anything that we see inside of PvP right now. One of the things that they really should look at is figuring out a way to actually make it so that teams that utilize tactics in some way, whether it's flanking, properly deploying skills, or anything like that, can actually get an advantage as opposed to the people who simply just run up and get point blank and just start shooting. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. I just really wanted to kind of get my thoughts out there from a PvE perspective on how it would be nice to actually make PvP more enticing and basically worth going into and spending time on. If you guys did enjoy this video, a like is super appreciated. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more upcoming content, and let me know down in the comments how you guys feel about PvP, what your hopes are for patch 1.6, and kind of, what you would like to see Massive do to make PvP actually more enticing. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.